Hey everybody, welcome back to Indianapolis. For the first time in a couple years, Spencer and I are back at the NFL Combine, the 2022 version. Not the heaviest crowd of Buckeyes, deepest crop here working out this week, but 3 days of it, and Spencer, Holbrook, and I are going to break it down with a little bit of rapid reaction. It's brought to you by Byers Auto. 7 players, I guess I should say, that were here for the Buckeyes. And what's your number one takeaway, Spencer, from what we learned here in Indianapolis? I guess we'd probably start with the wide receivers.
Yeah, I don't think it's something we learned, but the wide receivers are fast.
Oh, confirmation.
They're very good, and they're both going to go in the first round. And I actually think one thing that I learned was that Chris Olave has a chance now to be, one of those first 2 or 3 guys. I thought maybe he would slip down to the 4th or 5th guy, maybe at the bottom of the first round. But you look at that 40 time and the way he was smoothing it out of his routes during the workouts, the way that he caught the ball, the way he's going to wow people in the interview room, and just his work ethic. It's not crazy to think that he can't leap up into the 15 range, maybe even 13.
Yep.
Browns. A lot of Browns fans watch these things, so it's not crazy to think that can happen now. And that 40 time really solidified that he can be one of those top guys. That's the biggest takeaway for me.
Yeah, that 4.26 second 40-yard dash, that was unofficial. It didn't wind up being his official time, but it definitely caught enough attention because the official time was still good enough, still sub 4.4. He and Garrett Wilson both go under that, and it was strange to me in the buildup. You knew that both of these guys were already projected as first-round draft picks, and it would have been a pretty big surprise if they didn't come off the board that early. But there was a weird sort of narrative around these guys, well, how fast is Garrett Wilson really? What is Chris Olave going to test well? What's his ceiling? It's it just forgot, not just what they had done on the field, but that Chris Olave, the whole appeal coming into Ohio State was how fast he was. And I remember doing the stories about him just going out for baseball one season, couldn't really do anything else, didn't hit, just was a pinch runner and go steal a bunch of bases. The guy was always fast.
Yeah.
It was just crazy that sort of thing didn't exist, talking about him. Jeremy Ruckert couldn't run. As we go through the list there at tight end, he did the bench press right over there. 19 reps that officially counted for that. Be interesting to see what happens with his stock. Anybody else that you thought really made any moves or impressions on you this week, Spencer?
Well, I mean, it'd be hard not to talk about Nicholas Petit Ferreira and how excited he is, even to go through medical examinations that everyone seems to hate. Nicholas Petit Ferreira was having the time of his life. And, Thayer Munford was Thayer Munford. He's very candid. He's going to tell you exactly how it is. And, he made a couple headlines with what he said about defensive ends, and that kind of caught my eye because, the bottom line is Chase Young and Nick Bosa are 2 of the best draft prospects on the defensive line in the last decade. So for him to say that, that they were the best he's faced, I mean, it's not really crazy to say. So I think the headlines were a little misplaced and misguided, but all these guys are going to have some impressive things to say, and they're all going to impress a little bit. I know that we're going to wait and see, 40 times for the offensive lineman and bench press and those kind of things, but the story is going to be the wide receivers, but all of these guys, I think, only help themselves. I think Tyreke Smith has a chance to really elevate his draft stock in the coming days.
It's not trash talk to say that 2 top 5 picks who were NFL Defensive Rookies of the Year and Nick Bosa, who's going to be probably the highest paid defensive player maybe in NFL history soon, that those guys were better than Aiden Hutchinson. It wasn't rivalry trash talk.
No.
It's so bizarre how some of this stuff gets. Anybody who was there knows what Thayer was trying to say. Those are the guys he was a freshman, sophomore working against them. And that was an extremely difficult matchup at any point in anyone's career, and he had to do that early on. Of course that's going to form a lasting impression for him. It had nothing to do with what happened in November in the Big House, which I believe he was also dealing with something that Tyreke Smith brought up, which was that 20 players had the flu. That's a conversation for another day. We don't need to relitigate that or talk about the Big House anymore, but that was certainly part of it. Look at Nick Petit Ferreira. I thought that his decision was probably the most curious at the time. Thought he would have really benefited, and that Ohio State would have as well, obviously, with another year for him to develop. But as you mentioned, Spencer, the exuberance, the joyfulness that he had just to be here and doing every part of the combine, you can understand why. It's easy to sometimes forget that these guys are 19, 20, 21-year-old young men about to become millionaires or achieve lifelong dreams, or both at the same time, and that would have been difficult for anyone to turn down. Absolutely. So you don't fault him for that part. But that's leads me to the point where you're looking at these 7 guys, and you already know that Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, that Ohio State is pretty well stocked up with Jackson Smith and Jigba leading that group at wide receiver. They're going to be fine there. We look at offensive line, those 2 guys. Paris Johnson ready to step in, DeJuan Jones back at tackle, Matthew Jones at guard, good shape there. Defensive ends, defensive tackle with Haskell Garrett here, pretty well stocked. I mean, Ohio State has 7 players here. Normally they might have double that, but that tells you how much talent is returning to this team, and that's really what all 7 of these guys said, well, look out for this guy, this guy, this guy. Spring ball starting on Tuesday. The reason that Ohio State doesn't have to have a busy combine is because next year's going to be crazy.
Well, and when you look at the way that this roster is going to be set up for Ohio State, the biggest questions are probably in the trenches as far as, can they get tougher? Can they get bigger and better? And by all accounts, what we've heard here is that they can.
Yeah.
And so the guys that are going to be coming here next year, mainly Teron Vincent, like when you hear 2 different guys talk that highly of Teron, and I know that, part of that is they've been with Teron for 4 years. They're probably very good friends with him. As we can't just dismiss that fact. But the fact that they're talking so glowingly of what Teron could become on the field, that's a former 5-star guy who's going to have a chance to wow scouts next year in his extra year. And it's a guy who hasn't ever taken that next step. But when you see, 2 guys who are going to be probably top 150 players talk about how good he can be, I mean, it makes you excited for what could happen on the defensive line.
I think it's definitely a combination of 2 different players independently talking about Teron Vincent and bringing his name up first, and what you saw in the Rose Bowl, which was easily the finest game of his career, setting the stage. I mean, there was at least a thought in Teron Vincent's mind about going pro. Now, he made a prudent decision, in my estimation, to come back, and because if you stack together 5, 6, 7, 8 games like what he did in the Rose Bowl, then you become an All-American, then you become a potential 1st or 2nd round draft pick at this time next year. A lot of conversation about him. I think you're looking at Josh Fryer was a name that I heard a lot from the offensive linemen. And even Tyreke Smith about going against him and how much better he had gotten. I don't know how exactly that will play out. That Paris Johnson should be at left tackle. DeJuan Jones is returning at right tackle. And we saw in training camp at times Josh Fryer really making a move in last year in spring, potentially being a fit at guard. It seems like he's heading towards a career at tackle, so I don't know where Ohio State will land on what to do with that group, and maybe he just is the 3rd guy in the mix at tackle this year. I don't know, but certainly a lot of people that are impressed with what he's doing.
Yeah, and it's not Thayer and Nicholas Petit Ferreira mentioning him. It's the speed with which Tyreke Smith was able to recall how good Fryer was.
Yeah.
He was asked who's an offensive lineman that's going to surprise people, and he immediately just he said Fryer. And that tells you everything you need to know that a guy with the upside and the potential that Tyreke Smith has in the NFL to bring up a backup offensive tackle the way he did. I mean, that's pretty telling on what this offensive line could be if that's your 3rd tackle.
Yeah.
Maybe it's even your 2nd tackle. Sometimes guys just simply get jumped. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I don't want to start a controversy, but Josh Fryer, if he's getting mentioned among that group, there's going to be some conversations about maybe a battle at tackle. And so a lot of intrigue heading into spring ball for Ohio State that generates from the combine, which I always love.
Well, and I think that we're going to have a lot of time to talk about that next week, but the way that Thayer Munford, Tyreke Smith, Nicholas Petit Ferreira talked about that offensive line in that group, I sort of went into this week thinking, well, everything is relatively settled there. You put Paris Johnson at left tackle. Matthew Jones is going to be right there at left guard. Luke Lippler is returning at center. Donovan Jackson looks like an absolute future star at right guard. And then DeJuan Jones is back. I mean, maybe that won't be the case.Maybe Josh Fryer is able to put it's a clean slate with a new position coach. We don't know, what's going to play out with that. I felt like I had a pretty good idea of it, but you're talking about Harry Miller maybe being healthy and coming off the knee, being a factor there. Obviously what we heard about Fryer could be a lot more competitive than we maybe thought, but either way, it's still driving home this larger point that Ohio State has way more talent to work with than just about any program in the country right now.
Yeah, and like I said, Fryer was the 3rd tackle potentially, and he's getting mentioned among these guys. The defensive line, it's kind of funny to listen to those guys do the laundry list of defensive linemen that have a chance to become good. We obviously didn't talk to anybody about the secondary, but that position looks like it's retooled and restocked. And then the wide receivers, I mean, good God, it was almost too easy to ask Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, who's going to step up? Well, how much time do you have? Because there's quite a few guys, but the guy that was mentioned maybe to a higher level than anyone else is Marvin Harrison Jr. And you look at the reports coming out of winter workouts and some of those highlights and some of those screen grabs of what he could do, and then you look at the Rose Bowl, and then you get the scouting report from the two best wide receivers in this building right now, and I don't think C.J. Stroud's going to have any problems finding Marvin Harrison Jr.
Well, and beyond that, the first name that I think when I asked Chris Olave that, the first name he mentioned was not Marvin, it was Jaden Ballard. And he gets a little bit overlooked in this because he came in with two guys in Emeka Egbuka and Marvin Harrison, who got on the field early and made an impact and had a little bit higher recruiting profiles, and also talked a little bit more. We're out there more in the media than a very private Jaden Ballard. When Chris Olave says that a guy can fly and that he's got elite speed, well, what he proved in that building right over there should tell you that he knows what speed is and what high-end speed looks like. So if Jaden Ballard can keep up with those guys, you're looking at maybe he just it's the part of Ohio, the way that they talk about his deep ball skills and his speed. I'm starting to get like some Devin Smith type vibes from Jaden Ballard. I don't want to put too much on it too soon, but he shouldn't be. The point is he shouldn't be forgotten going into this spring camp, and it's possible that Ohio State could expand that wide receiver unit past the top three. They had good reason to stick with those three last year, and you know that Jackson Smith and Jig was going to catch a ton of footballs. Julian Fleming, both the shoulders are ready. You've seen those flashes start peeking through for him. Marvin Harrison and Buka, and then Ballard in there. Like maybe that's what we're talking about. I don't know, but I know that. Just about any team in the country would look at that and be like, they're losing 2 first-round draft picks, and they're absolutely fine.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy because last year, all 3 of those guys in the rotation, so, we're using the word rotation a little oddly, but all of those guys could do everything. Well, you look at this roster, and, Marvin Harrison Jr., I don't know if he's going to completely take the top off, but he's going to be really good at everything he does. But then Julian Fleming has shown through a couple of years, I know it's a lot of injuries, but he's kind of a possession receiver. He kind of reminds me of what Austin Mack was for Ohio State.
Yeah.
Then you look at Jackson Smith and Jigba playing the slot, Emeka Egbuka playing, either way. This team doesn't have a traditional true deep threat. And so maybe Jaden Ballard works his way into the lineup that way on becoming, hey, if he's on the field, there's a fly route to be had.
Right.
And so maybe that's going to work to his advantage, that this isn't a 3-man group that's all complete receivers. Maybe they all have different roles, kind of like a traditional wide receiver room, because as good as Ohio State's been in the last couple of years, they haven't had a traditional wide receiver room because all those guys could just do everything. They didn't have to.
Yeah, I know how much it meant to Ohio State. I was texting with somebody around the Woody last night about that, and after the 40 times came in, I know that it had been a big emphasis for Brian Hartline that had been 15 years since Ohio State had a first-round draft pick, and he was part of those units that were churning out guys, and Ohio State kept doing that. We know Mike Thomas, Terry McLaurin down the road, guys who were making an impact but just weren't first-round draft picks, and got a response back after that happened. And it's like, all caps, we're back. So that's what they feel about the Ohio State wide receivers room, Zone 6. They were pretty good and pretty productive before then, but they are really elevating it to a different level. They'll be busy again at this time in 2023 at the NFL Combine. We'll see if there will be another rapid reaction brought to you by Byers Auto. Then hopefully it stays in Indy. Just make my case.
Do you have a prediction on how many Buckeyes will be here next year? Maybe it would be fun to look back on.
I think it'll be 14, just off the top of my head.
I'm going to go 13.
There it is. It's the first bold prediction for the NFL Combine, 1 year in advance. What a perfect way to wrap up our first and only Rapid Reaction of the Week, brought to you by Byers Auto. He's Spencer Holbrook. I am Austin Ward. Stay with us for full coverage of the Ohio State Buckeyes all year at LettermenRow.com.